It's a plaster piece. I think I was going to try to fire it, the original clay, and then I had some issues with it, so I made a mold of it and cast it into plaster. And it's kind of a earlier work when I was just coming out of art school and was using the figurative study to do stories, little narratives. Snake Charmer, this particular piece. I think of them as cinematic because there's little stories that are taking place as you swirl around it. At the time I was just more interested in interacting faces and how one face dissolves into multiple different faces. I think it's similar to what I'm doing today, other than I'm not as literal in the sense of how I'm working. Here I'm trying to be more literal. It's kind of taking the narrative out of my work and just replace it with the motion of a narrative. Welcome to my studio. I'm Jonathan Hertzel. I am a sculptor, painter here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I'm happy you would come. I never really felt like I was an artist until after I graduated from the University of Rochester. I graduated with a degree in history, and I was always interested in the arts and always did it on the side. I always took sculpture classes and dance classes and things like that. I was always intrigued with the figure. You know, from early on, the figure has, I think, been the foundation of a lot of my work, even though I've kind of broken off into abstraction. The sort of gestural figuration, I think, comes through in the work. There's kind of a dissolve taking place in the biology and sort of a, you know, kind of revealing an energy. That was actually from the Baum School of Art, where I was teaching a portrait and a figure class. So we'd have models come in, and we had this big tree stump, and that's what he's sitting on. And this one I've kind of broken open a little bit, starting to reveal maybe an interior root structure that often my kind of later works kind of feel like. They're kind of rooty and stuff. So it was kind of interesting that he was sitting on that root. That interior life is starting to develop, which became the focus of my later work. Most of the bronze work is based on that, and even a lot of the clay pieces have that sensibility, more that what's starting to take place in the interior. The shell's being broken. After graduating from the University of Rochester, moving to Philadelphia and going to the Academy of the Fine Arts, where I studied more of portrait and figure and drawing and painting, where also I met my lovely wife, Linda. I used to think of my work as being cinematographic, and they're very indicative of this period of work I used to do, which were somewhat all narrative and interwoven figures and technology, and I did a whole series of these heads as well as a series of reliefs. It was built directly in clay and fired with a glaze that I used. It was called I called it a lichen glaze because it looked like the type of lichen that you would see on stones. Started like working much more about the motion as opposed to identifiable characters. But if you kind of look into it, they're woven in. You see the head. This is a head and shoulders, and it opens up and revealing sort of the interior energy of the form. So part of the earlier works that I was doing, the narratives, I did a whole series of astronauts, or I actually referred to them as terranauts. They're kind of Earth creatures, and they're all suited up in order to live on the Earth because the environment was getting so deteriorated. So these are kind of Earth suits. This particular one is called photosynthesized, and he's kind of holding a burnt stick, and his backpack has a breakdown of photosynthesis. It's the sun, the leaf, on the one side, and then on the other side there's the five senses, the smell, sight, hearing, touch, and taste. And I guess that backpack is kind of ensuring the survival of the character inside of it. The character's kind of gaunt, like his face is kind of very Giacomettian, of course, because I love Giacometti. And he's kind of deteriorated and kind of withering away, and it's the suit that sort of puffs him up and helps with his survival. I've explored a lot of different materials and found that each materials bring something else to your work. I do jump around in materials. I love different materials and exploring them. And I'll go through cycles. I went through a whole cycle of using discarded elements and electronic pieces that I was doing stories about a mechanized electronic world taking over kind of humanity, as is what's happening today. But I used to do them with the wire figures and things along that line. From that, would jump in, I did a whole series of clay pieces and explored a little bit more of my educational upbringing. Being a student at the Academy of the Fine Arts, it was very portrait and figure oriented. Then would incorporate those figures in the stories that I would tell, the narratives that I would tell. I was a filmmaker for a while too, and that's one of the things that I feel like my art comes back to. It's that sense of motion. The constantly changing narratives, even when they're static and still, they're in constant motion. Clay being a medium which I felt very comfortable working with, and it was a very accessible material. I did quite a bit of clay work and, fired clay pieces. With the clay pieces, I had these big open forms, and they were somewhat fragile. You could do it and stuff, but you had to handle with care. With bronze, it's such an indestructible material that it was such a joy to sort of, create these open spaces out of these kind of little fingery types of shapes and forms that would weave in and around the figure. So it allowed me to get into sort of a more porous form. As I think of myself as an expressionist, an abstract expressionist, but tending toward figuration, most of the work that I've made are all just one of a kind. The clay pieces I would fire directly. I do have some that I've cast and made editions of, but the majority of the bronze work, or at least this sort of open forms that I've been creating, are not conducive to making molds and casting. They're just too complex. So I just do them as one-of-a-kind pieces. Most of my work is always traveling, from one place to another. They're all like travelers. They look as if they're walking figures, but they never really go forward. They seem to always just kind of turn around themselves. So at any point you could look at it, it feels like it might be moving back toward you as it's moving away from you at the same time. It becomes more apparent when you get to see it sort of rotating and moving around. I did a whole series of figures called the reversals. I did them in clay and bronze. And they are figures that sort of, again, are reversing themselves. That's when I was just making pieces of wax and piecing them together, not knowing where they were going to go, but when I got them back in bronze, I stitched them somehow together to make the piece. That one's the twin serpents. That's the falling man, falling to earth. So these mixed media wire type pieces came about probably my last year at the Academy of the Fine Arts. We did a lot of figure studies, and at one point did a life-size figure. So everybody in the class had to build an armature out of steel. You either cast the piece or you just break it apart again at the end. So I had the armature, and I just started wrapping wire and different materials that I would find on my way to the studio, because there was always something being thrown out. And I did these life-size figures out of those pieces, out of those armatures. And then I actually bought some from the other students who didn't really want them, and built a few other life-size works. And then from the life-size, I actually ended up going to smaller pieces. For quite a few years, I pretty much focused on sculpture, working from the different mediums, clay, into wax, into bronze, plaster works, things along that line. But even as I worked as a sculptor, I always painted. It has become increasingly the mainstay of my art expression these days. I kind of react to on a daily basis. And it's just become a daily process where I feel like it's almost like a journal of marks and expressions and shapes. I feel like I'm only making one big painting, and I'm just doing it in sections. And hopefully they'll all piece together. And I do like to kind of stack the pieces next to each other, creating grids with the work. Color combinations are just more the mood or what I'm feeling in the time I'm painting. As of late, most of the work is about water, is about swimming and sort of reacting to waves, and so the colors have kind of evolved into that kind of more of a watery, I shouldn't say fury, but a watery agitation. I made a series of drawings based on refugees sort of battling the waves, or battling the ocean, trying to find new ground to land on and to live in, because we all come from the ocean. The larger paintings that I'm doing now are for a photo booth, which I've called the abstract random photo booths. They become these backgrounds for people to pose in, wearing costumes or the clothing that I've painted. So the sculpture that I was doing in the past now is sort of being done in painting, and I'm clothing people that can then pose in front of the paintings, and they become sort of the sculptural element of the paintings. love to draw. I mean, drawing is like breathing, and I often do drawings to sort of prepare for works that I'm going to produce. Often I'll do combinations of drawings, or I'll put drawings together in a book-like form. The books sometimes follow narratives out of stories that I've read, abstracted versions, of course. I'll work in pen and ink. I'll work with watercolor, pencils. I use lots of different materials because I seem to enjoy playing with anything that makes a mark. I do have works in a number of museums. I have some of my earlier works, the more representational pieces, at Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts Museum, a piece called Crystal Knot. It's a clay piece and a mixed media. At the James A. Michener Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, I have a number of works in their collection. One particular bronze called Observer is at the entrance of the museum, as well as they own some of the earlier terracotta or clay pieces, the terranauts that I've made. At Grounds for Sculpture in Hamilton, New Jersey, I have two bronzes, one an 8-foot bronze called Gathering, and the other piece is called Smoking Root. It's a 6-foot bronze, and they grow out of the earth as if they're planted in the gardens. Consider myself a figurative artist, but I've kind of left the biology of the figure behind and have just sort of tried to depict or suggest the underlying energy of the figure, the form, the unconscious energy, the sort of spiritual energy, the emotional energy of a form. So the things that you cannot see. You can see the biology, but you don't always see what's happening behind the biology. So that's my work is really much more about the energy that makes up the figure. Because that's a universal. I mean, I'm not talking about a cultural or a specific segment of humanity. I'm talking about, this is what we all feel. We're all feeling this sort of interaction that takes place, underneath us or within us. And I think that's pretty much what I'm trying to paint or sculpt. Is that good?